Philip had stopped over on his way down from Finland to Brunswick on leave before attending SS officers' candidate school. Wolf said that he himself still had rather close ties to Finland since the end of World War I, and had asked Philip to let him have some direct information about the warfare in the north. Wolf intuited that I would like to see Philip again and suggested that I join them on their walk the next morning. For the rest of the evening we talked about Finland, Wolf responding with patience to all my questions about his special relationship with that country. I was captivated by his outline of the Finnish fight for independence, first when in 1918 the Bolsheviks tried to overthrow the new Finnish government, and then, 20 years later in the Winter War after the Russian invasion in 1939. He still had many friends among the Finnish officer corps. This unequal struggle between dwarf and giant was fascinating for the bravery and resolution of the people and soldiers of this small country. At the same time, it seemed to me to be a variation of the struggle between white and red discribed by Edwin Eric Dwinger in his novel of the same title. It had impressed me as a story of the struggle between good and evil, and had strengthened my conviction that the arch-evil in this world was Bolshevism. On that evening in Brunswick, I could not foresee that this conversation would be a prelude to an experience I was to have myself, but it was in that conversation with Wolf that the ground was laid for my sympathy and affection toward that country and its brave folk. The next morning, the reunion with Philip was warm and hearty. During the last few months, he had been with a mountain infantry regiment in North Karelia. He was wearing their uniform with the insignia of a corporal. In the buttonhole of his tunic there was the ribbon of the Iron Cross Tude class. He had become even leaner and more mature, a shade more grave perhaps. The two lines about his mouth had become a bit sharper. In our conversation, though, his old winning smile still flitted over his face as it had 2 years ago. Our former relationship, however, the one between the older and the younger leader of the Jung Volk, was gone. There was an air of remoteness about him. Perhaps it was my own feeling of distance from the soldier in the front line, my own consciousness that it would still take some time until I would share his soldierly duties in this war. The three of us, Wolf, Philip and I, went off for an hour's walk on the wall. To me, Philip's account of the fighting in North Karelia sounded like Red Indian tales. The Gebirgsjäger, or Jager for short, as the mountain infantry were called, roamed the marshy tundra and the wooded taiga wilderness, far from their bases, with their supply dependent only on endless mule trains. There were ferocious encounters with Ivon, often man-to-man, relying on infantry weapons only, all of that taking place during the long summer days, swarming with mosquitoes, and later, as winters begin early in the far north, in the merciless cold and almost constant darkness. I gathered that the joint German-Finnish campaign initially was directed against the railway line connecting the ice-free harbour of Murmansk to Leningrad. But it was only much later that I recalled and understood the meaning of Philip, questioning Wolf about future operational intentions with respect to that line. Wolf's response was cautious and indirect. He said something about there being no alliance between Germany and Finland, and that Finland was not at war with England and the United States after all, but that this situation was likely to change if that railway line were taken. At that time, it was beyond my grasp that the two brothers-in-arms, as Finland and Germany called their relationship, could have different war aims. Philip stayed for lunch. At the table we talked about my Uncle Peter's and his family's precarious situation in Stockholm. He had been sacked by his British employers. So much had been clear from his letters to his mother. There remained, however, some mysteries in their correspondence, which apparently were hard to explain in writing. He was considering returning to Germany because, so far, he had not succeeded in finding a suitable position elsewhere. My grandmother encouraged his return, although such a step would for him mean military service in a conflict in which we knew he had no desire to participate. My image of Peter and my understanding of his life underwent a sobering change. Peter, the cosmopolitan born in Australia, graduated from the University of Vienna, married in London to a Swedish girl, travelling with a British passport, had designed for himself a life without regard for political borders, or at least a regard which was more and more insignificant. Now this course of life had reached an impasse. Suddenly he found himself subjected to new regulations made for nationals rather than for cosmopolitans. Borders had become immensely important. And where did that leave him? After lunch, Philip stayed on, undoubtedly to get Wolfe's assessment of the situation at the Eastern Front. Tacitly, I was permitted to listen in. We settled down in a corner of the sitting room. Outside, dusk was falling. In the twilight of the room, the features of the two soldiers became more and more obscure in the course of Wolfe's gloomy account of what was happening in the East, in Army Group Centre in particular. Anything could happen, he said. The High Command could only hope that the front line would hold. When the Russians had started their counter-offensive early in December, it had been too late for an orderly withdrawal to a more favourable line, so they had to hold on and order the troops to hold their positions wherever they were. All odds, Wolfe said, were against our troops. Outnumbered by fresh Russian reserves clad in fur-lined winter clothes, our soldiers were exposed to both the attack of fresh troops and the worst Russian winter in memory. The High Command had to call for the utmost from the troops to prevent disaster, to demand that the ground be held at all costs, disregarding the soldiers' exhaustion from the autumn fighting in the mud and the lack of proper protection against the winter's cold. Sometimes it looked as if Wolfe were about to stop his gloomy appraisal, but the familiar surrounding of the house and Philip's trustworthiness seemed to diminish his normal restraint, and he continued his account. On his last visit out there 3 weeks before, he had heard reports and witnessed scenes of indescribable suffering and hardship. It made him think, he said, of Caulaincourt's description of Napoleon's campaign of 1812. "Self-sacrifice is duty," were the closing words of a commanding general's order of the day issued during the time Wolfe had been out there. Could one think of a more blunt order? And yet, he said, it reflected precisely the situation and the needs in the Army Group Centre sector. Obviously, at that time no one knew whether the thin screens of infantry, constituting the front line in the vast expanses, would hold and prevent a general collapse. Philip blurted, "Quite frankly, sir, it seems clear that the campaign has been a failure, stuck in the Russian winter as we are. Is this the reason why the Field Marshal has had to go?" "We should have been finished with the campaign by the end of November. It was planned as another lightning stroke," Wolfe replied. "Well, it didn't work this time. Now we know it will be a long time before it's over. Fresh Russian armies may continue to arrive on the scene, and the Americans will probably provide support via Murmansk if our Navy and the Luftwaffe let them. We underestimated the Russians' strength and the endurance of their troops. And, moreover, there have been quite unnecessary delays with important decisions, certainly not the fault of the Field Marshal. Anyway, he's a sick man. His heart. The strain has been too much." "Do you think the war can still be won?" Philip asked in a subdued voice. Wolfe hesitated. His silence became awkward. "To be quite frank, I can't tell you because I don't know," he said at last. "As I just have said, now the odds are against us. And what is true of the Eastern Front is, in the long run, probably true for the overall situation. Seen from the view of a staff officer, our prospects are at least dubious." He went on to muse about something he said he couldn't explain. There had been great doubts on the part of the General Staff about other campaigns in the past, very well founded in facts and figures, yet still, somehow, in the end, the Führer had always succeeded in dispelling those doubts. His gift of reassuring his entourage and visitors to his headquarters came close to magic. He said he had seen it happen more than once and added, "What's more, until recently he's always been right, against all odds." We were now sitting in complete darkness. None of us had given a thought to putting on the lights. Philip remembered that he was supposed to leave. He rose. Wolfe and I got up also. "I am most grateful, sir, for your confidence," Philip said, standing in front of Wolfe, very erect, as if to suggest that this exceptional hour of frankness had now to be replaced by normal military conduct. It may seem odd, but in the end I feel encouraged by your frankness rather than disheartened. We must believe in the things that cannot be explained. What else can we do, sir, after all? Wolf did not comment. He gave Philip a warm smile instead. They shook hands. I hope to see you again. Good luck, my boy. God bless you. I had suggested walking Philip home, eager to have some words with him in private. Wolf saw us out. Before Philip turned the corner of the house, he looked back, raising his hand to his cap. Wolf was standing in the doorway, small, lean, erect in his tight tunic, thoughtfully returning Philip's salute. As we trotted along the wall, the dark lightened up only by the snow. We were in a pensive mood. Philip broke the silence. Well, we have had a glimpse behind the scenes, haven't we? And what we could see was anything but encouraging. You said you were encouraged. Well, I had to say that, but I think there is more to it than your uncle's cool military view. I like him, really. He's impressive and at the same time neither aloof nor condescending. Like many other military men, however, he appears to look at this war as a game of chess-2 adversaries. One white, one black. The next game, it's vice versa. It's all the same. Once you see you can't win any more, well, that's it. The game is over. In war, I'm afraid, their cool conclusion is, stop all unnecessary suffering and sacrifices. Seek peace immediately. No, Philippe, that's not what he said, I interrupted. No, of course not, don't get me wrong. What I'm trying to say is that we can't look at this war in the East as a game played by the rules. It's the clash between culture and nihilism, between the values of the Occident against the negation of all values of the past. No rules are acknowledged on the other side. The only rule they acknowledge is the rule of the proletariat. Look at the innumerable crimes committed in that name. They have slain millions of kulaks to eradicate private property, 12 million in the Ukraine alone. They have turned churches into pigsties to get rid of God. They have trampled all values upheld before their own calendar began. Then they have started to murder their own kind. And from the beginning they were determined to take any opportunity to impose their system on the West. First, they tried in Germany, then in Spain. He was speaking quite dispassionately, as if talking to himself rather than to make a point against Wolf. So I let him go on and listened. If you think of it, it's Europe as a whole against Bolshevism. Germany is its spearhead, and for good reasons, indeed, for its most perilous position, for its will to stand up against the threat, and for its leadership. It's no game of chess, no joust between knights in shining armour, no war to be won by military strength and professionalism alone. At heart, I agreed with him, again, dwingers between white and red coming to my mind. I had heard similar words before, however, from quarters not held in high esteem in my family, propaganda talk from the wrong persons in their yellow-brown uniforms, in their self-important, puffed-up language. So I spontaneously took on the role of the devil's advocate. Don't you think the rules of military professionalism are paramount in times of war? I think it's dangerous to predict that Weltanschauung, worldview, will dominate military professionalism. Would Weltanschauung help the soldier out there in the cold? I asked, somewhat harshly. He was quiet, then said, We need both, high military proficiency and a broader view than that of just another war between European nations fighting out their old rivalries. The vision of a Europe as determined as Germany is to keep out Bolshevism. A vision other young Europeans are ready to go to war for, young idealists determined to make that commitment. Your uncle may be right. Perhaps in the long run Germany alone isn't strong enough, but in the long run such a new vision could attract hundreds of thousands of volunteers to help. By now we had arrived at his parents' house. In the dark he was trying to look into my eyes, grabbing me by the arm. Do you think I'm talking propaganda? Well, I'm not. That vision is already being realised. Volunteers keep coming in from almost all parts of Europe. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Switzerland, the South Tyrol. They all have been incorporated into the Waffen-SS, which is about to form Germanic divisions. Soon the forces of the Waffen-SS will be fighting not only for our country, but for our common European heritage. I felt carried along by his enthusiasm, anxious to hear more. He talked to me about young soldiers, all volunteers, about modern warfare of small groups of infantry operating on their own, and about their young officers he had met, their high military proficiency, picked from battle-hardened frontline troops, some of them already highly decorated. On his way back from Karelia, he had been in touch with them in Berlin. Obviously, they had deeply impressed him as a new elite emerging in this war. These people, he said, are totally different from everything we knew of the General SS, not to speak of the party people. Suddenly, our old relationship was restored. Here was something new and exciting which we could share. Listening to him, I almost forgot that he was serving in the army. When I said so, he confided to me that he had just initiated his transfer to the Waffen-SS and hoped to be assigned to attend their officers' candidate school before the end of his leave. His family didn't know yet, and he wasn't sure at all about their reaction. Anyway, he said he had already talked too much and really had to go now. He turned to the house and disappeared. "Good luck to you," was all I could say for a goodbye. Walking back, I tried to form a coherent picture of the things I had learned this afternoon. I did not take the direct way back. I needed time. First, it was the dramatic bluntness of the German general's order of the day at the Eastern Front: self-sacrifice is duty. That rang in my ear and made my idealistic and somewhat romantic mind respond. Thrown into the turmoil of war at that age, I was no exception in my eagerness to make a contribution as soon as I was old enough. There was a good deal of daydreaming involved. It had to be something special, such as joining the paratroops and then being assigned to some daredevil jump behind the Russian lines. Against this background, Philip's version of the Waffen-SS and its pan-European dimension had a new and strong attraction. Aside from the hope it offered in the gloomy atmosphere of that winter, I had the vague notion of something new coming into being, an entirely new perspective, perhaps even going beyond the war and the old rivalries of European nations. Could it be the new Reich, evoked in Stefan George's poem, of which I can remember only the last lines? And yet I wasn't ready for a commitment. That would come later. I only felt the need for clarity. Perhaps I could bring up the subject with Wolf if he was still awake. When I came back to the house, however, Wolf was gone. There had been a phone call requesting him to report to Berlin the next day. He had left in the car. He leads through storm and dreadful signals of pale red dawn his loyal troop unto the work of the awoken day, and plants the new Reich. It's hard to explain what in the end made me decide to join the Waffen-SS. Back in 1942, I didn't ask myself that question, but now, in 1945, it has become important. What made a youth of 17, coming from a decent family, go astray and become a member of what the Allies had now branded as a criminal gang? How did it happen? What went wrong? Primarily, I think, it was the unfavourable course the war had taken at that time in the fall of 1942, and the differing responses to the worsening prospects among those of my age group. On the one side, there were those who were anxious to come through the war unscathed. On the other were those who felt this was the time to redouble their efforts to win the war. In retrospect, it seems these two attitudes affected one another in a polarising way. To explain that, however, I should go back and describe life at home in that third year of the war. It was on an afternoon early in September when I was out in the forest with Christina. After a while, Christina looked up and said in a low voice, "Let's close our eyes and let's wish for something, one wish for each of us." With that, she closed her eyes, and I saw her eyelashes nestling down on her cheeks as softly as a butterfly lowering its wings on a warm stone in the sun. "Tell me your wish," she asked. "I want to kiss you," I said. "I knew you would say that," she replied, and mischievously added, "So I have picked a different wish for myself." "Don't you want to know my wish?" "Sure. I almost forgot. Tell me." She paused, musing and looking on the glade. When our eyes met, hers had become dark. With a voice huskier than usual, she said, I wished that when this war was over we would meet again, here at our place, you and me, as soon as both of us are back. The shadow of the war that had hung over our youth from the beginning had reached us even here. There was no sanctuary, yet she smiled a brave and somewhat sad smile, her eyes full of love. It was getting dark, time to leave. When I came home, my mother said there had been a letter from my father in the mail. He was coming home on leave, and he had good news of my brother, Nick, who, after passing his final exams at the gymnasium, had been drafted and was now at the Eastern Front, apparently within reach of my father. I also got a letter from my friend, Hans, who had joined the paratroops and wrote enthusiastically about his jump training. The day before, I had learned that my predecessor in my present function in the Jungwolk had been promoted to lieutenant in the infantry. My unrest at continuing to lead a relatively peaceful life in private was steadily increasing. Looking forward to my father's leave, my mother had been in a talkative mood, so after supper we had one of the long talks we used to have in my last year at home. My mother was understanding when we discussed once more my intention of enlisting. It must have seemed quite natural to her that young people of my age were responding in that way to the call of duty, for this was in accordance with her generation's experience in similar circumstances over 20 years before. Her generation, however, had experienced a world war being lost, and in the years before the current war, she never had concealed her nagging doubts about our leadership after the Versailles Diktat and its ability to restore our national dignity with prudence, that is, without waging war. Regarding the odd set of party officials on the local and regional level, how could one possibly believe that the political personnel as a whole were equal to the tasks with which the nation was now confronted? After all, for most of them, their only experience with managing violence was restricted to brawls in bars and street riots before 1933. Now we were at war with most of the world. The basic theme underlying almost all our talks was my parents' ambivalent relationship to National Socialism. Both came from families which for generations had been merchants, bankers, domain tenants, executives, lawyers, and civil servants. Their characters were formed by a basically conservative attitude, as well as by their experience of World War I and its aftermath. For all their basic convictions, it seemed to them inevitable and morally imperative that some sort of societal restructuring should follow the war. The Fronterlebnis, the comradeship of the front, the hardships jointly endured in the field, the joint efforts of all classes for a common cause during the 4 long years of the war, could not be ignored. Rather, was it a matter of justice that a modern society without class barriers be formed, based on equal opportunities and on a person's own efforts and achievements? Bringing down class barriers, acknowledging the value of any useful or creative form of work, was one of my mother's favorite ideas. At the same time, their experience with Germany's defeat and with the penalties imposed, at Versailles perceived as unfair punitive actions, had made them open to the idea of national identity and what was left of national pride. Another important part of my parents' experience was the Bolsheviks' various attempts to usurp power in post-war Germany. My father had been with a Freikorps in the Baltics for some time after the war. Later on, in 1920, he had witnessed the armed insurrection of communists in the Ruhr area and the arrival of political commissars from Russia. Then, against this background, both had followed the brutal struggle of the communists for political power in Berlin. My mother used to tell about communist quarters in Brunswick where, after the war, people of her kind were well advised to stay out lest they be stoned. For them, as for most Germans at that time, all this experience was evidence enough of the actual and continual danger of Germany becoming Bolshevized. I had often heard them talk of the need to withstand the Bolshevik menace and of the importance of establishing a genuine reconciliation of the classes as a prerequisite, an aim which National Socialism, in their view, was most likely to achieve. Autonomous military units fighting irregular troops infiltrated by the Bolsheviks, trying to destabilize and overthrow non-communist governments in post-WWI Germany. In this connection, their thinking was also formed by the unfavourable picture of Germany's recent feeble parliamentarian governments and their incapacity for coping with our post-war problems, the communist menace in particular. They certainly felt it was time for someone to accumulate and use political power to bring about strong joint action. Basically well disposed towards National Socialism for these reasons, after 1933 my mother had decided to join the movement, not as a mere hanger-on, but as an active member. Her interest in public affairs dated from her days when, at home in Brunswick and Hardenberg, she had listened to her parents' conversations. Her father had written his PhD thesis on Marx's Das Kapital and was throughout his professional life involved in public affairs. Through him, she had come to like the art of dispute. She thought it her duty to make a contribution, and she scorned those of the educated class, the intellectuals in particular, who, standing aside, thought themselves above making a commitment toward the goals of a labourers' party. She once said that no one was entitled to criticise unless he actually involved himself in making things better. In our nightly discussions at home, however, she used to play the devil's advocate. She would question any official political position so I could work out my own opinions on political developments, such as the ever-expanding war fronts, the boastful speeches that betrayed an underestimation of our opponents, the brutal actions against political dissenters, and other misdeeds of party officials. I sensed, however, that she expected from our discussions some reassurance about the justness of our cause. She liked to sum up one of her more severe criticisms in the reproach that the Nazis, even then the pejorative term for National Socialists, didn't behave much better than the Bolsheviks. Then it was my turn to set out the reasons for the justness of the Nazis' behaviour, that the justness of our cause justified the means that were necessary to retaliate for the merciless brutalities of our enemy in the East. She would insist on her position, however, such as, "Evil will never be destroyed. Usually it is inherited by the other side," one of her carefully coined, sometimes astonishing conclusions that resulted from her penchant for wrestling for days, sometimes weeks, with aspects of public affairs that worried her. One basic idea used to prevail in our talks, that after so short a period of time, not even 10 years, the Third Reich was in a state of transition that would produce a new stage in German society and its position in the world. Restoration of the Hohenzollern monarchy in any form was unthinkable, and it was evident that a new political elite was needed to replace the set that had emerged from the Kampfzeit. The war, we hoped, would help forge that new elite. Seasoned by the hardships of war service, they would return to or enter professional life and take the place of the party people as soon as the war was over. In particular, we thought this new elite would possess a profound notion of what it really meant to serve the common good. We were quite aware, however, that the longer the war lasted, the more that idea would lose its bearing as the casualties of the war actually diminished the ranks from which that elite might grow. All in all, this may not have been the utmost in political wisdom, but at the moment it had at least some plausibility. It was, at any rate, entirely different from the picture of Nazidom that I would eventually read about in the Stars and Stripes, according to which the evil course of the system was clearly visible from the outset. It is true that anything could happen under totalitarian rule, but it is also true that nothing was bound to happen. The person of Hitler remained untouched in our critical talks. To think of him as an irresponsible gambler and fanatic, as I am beginning to see him now, or even to think of him as capable of getting down to the extermination of the Jews under German control, was far beyond what we could conceive. My parents found Hitler's hate of the Jews repulsive. The SS paper Der Stürmer, with its ugly caricatures of Jews, was often cited by them as a paradigm of political vulgarity. But they saw this propaganda as but part of the revolutionary thrust of the movement and as wartime exaggerations that would recede as soon as the war was over. Besides, from what we could see, hear or read during the Third Reich, there were no indications of any large-scale crimes one reads about now, and the extent of which is still to me mind-boggling. Certainly, in 1938, after the German diplomat had been shot in Paris by the Jewish assassin Grinspan, there had been Kristallnacht, the breaking of windows of Jewish shops in our town and some other acts of violence. This incident, however, was one of those events my mother had furiously denounced in her local women's organisation, postulating that those responsible for the outrages were a disgrace to the party, just the kind of Radikalinskis that were no better than the Bolsheviks. In her eyes, they were the faction that must be kept down. I know little of any personal relations my family had with Jews. If there were any, they were not much discussed. The one of which I was aware was a high judge living across the street from my grandparents in Brunswick, a fellow of distinguished character, fond of playing in string quartets, who in the past sometimes would ask my Uncle Peter over to help out with the second violin. Outright anti-Semitism certainly wasn't part of my parents' thinking. As I recall occasional remarks, however, it becomes clear that there were certain reservations about Jews in general, certain signs of decadence my parents found disgusting in our cultural life in the 20s were associated with Jewish influence. I remember another, more significant point in their critical attitude, which was the role they assigned to Jewish intellectuals in the Russian Revolution and Bolshevik ideology which the Germans, they thought, were destined to resist. It touched a string in my parents' minds when Nazi propaganda associated the evil influence of Jewish intellectuals on Bolshevism with their rootless existence in the diaspora. We knew, of course, of concentration camps. To our knowledge, they were labour camps where conditions were hard but just. Had we known the official rule of conduct in those camps, Arbeit macht frei, work makes one free, we readily would have consented. If, on the other hand, we had known of or suspected any willful killings in the camps, which must have begun on a large scale about the time of my political discussions with my mother, our talks would have taken a different course, and our attitude would have radically changed. This thought is, I admit, a hypothesis and one of little consequence, but had the people in general known, I think that neither the killings nor the war could have continued in any meaningful way. It seems inconceivable from this distance that any authority in the Third Reich could have let the killings become public, could have taken any responsibility for them, and continued to stay in office. Inconceivable, too, that German soldiers' officers as well as plain soldiers, let alone a few fanatics, would have been ready to go on risking their lives for a cause so utterly corrupted. That kind of general knowledge would have delivered the death blow to any militari morale. That, in fact, both had taken place at the same time can only be perceived under the condition that the doings inside the camps were surrounded by absolute secrecy. That the war continued is, I think, strong evidence against the assumption that the German people knew what was going on. I forget which subject in particular we discussed on that evening in September 1942. At that time, I felt that I personally had little part in the past, that the political choices had not been for me to make, and that the only thing that mattered at present was that there was a war on that had to be won. The war had become our destiny, my destiny. I was left with the inescapable question of my age group. What are you going to do for your country? That one question became deeply engraved on our maturing minds during the war years. My response was simple enough, serve the best way I could. There was nothing specific in that except for the vague notion of belonging to a group which would have more than its normal share of duties. It was long after midnight on that night in September 1942 when we ended our talk. I put out the light and opened the curtains, drawn closed for the blackout, to let in fresh air. Moonlight poured into the room, and I could see the outlines of two familiar objects on top of the bookcase by the window. My father's World War I steel helmet and his sword. The next day at school, I made my decision. On that morning, Dr. Weyrich, our headmaster and English teacher, strode briskly into the classroom. Cheerfully rubbing his hands, his rosy face in a broad smile, he said, "Good morning, gentlemen. Please sit down. What are we going to do on this lovely morning? I think we'll write a little exercise." All in excellent English, of course. With that, we were asked to take a dictation. I've forgotten the subject of the text and its origin, but I remember that it was, in the circumstances, a subtle piece of insinuation. He was an Anglophile. Having spent some years abroad, he felt compelled to hand down to his pupils some knowledge of British customs and character that he found worth following. With regard to the Luftwaffe's offensive against targets in England, He would, visibly annoyed by the loud-mouthed German propaganda, warn against the illusion that British morale would be broken by it. "You think we'll bring them to heel? No, sir," he would say, wagging his forefinger like a metronome. "It will result in the opposite. It'll only stiffen their backbones. Believe me." It was not his Anglophilia, however, that endeared Heydrich to his pupils and their parents. It was generally known that he had been transferred to our school as headmaster for disciplinary reasons. In his former position as head of a department in the Brunswick Ministry of Education, he had refused to sign a letter of dismissal of a teacher who had resisted pressure to separate from his Jewish wife. My parents, associating with the Heydrichs privately, were glad to have that kind of teacher in charge of their son's education, while we, his pupils, had great respect for him. It was during the next lesson that the two different currents in our class surfaced. There were those whose attitude toward the war was like my own, for whom the war was a personal challenge, and who were eager to make a commitment. Then there were those who regarded the war as the business of others, of volunteers in particular, and who thought that no idea was worth the sacrifice of human life, at least not their own, and who, therefore, were looking for a safe haven to wait for the war to end. Of course, these two different currents were not as clear and as pure as I set them out here. There certainly were various impurities. There were varying degrees of romanticism or personal ambitions on the one hand, and personal weakness, intellectual or moral reticence, or sober calculation about the ultimate outcome of the war on the other, nor were these currents clearly visible. They surfaced only occasionally, and when they did, it was in some oblique way. Our second lesson was German with Dr. Hintz. Handicapped by a shortened leg and a wooden arm, he had joined the party early in the 20s when he studied German and history at the University of Munich. Endowed with a remarkable capacity for rhetoric and a sharp intellect combined with a peculiar mixture of refined and coarse language, as a sideline he assumed the responsibility of public speaker for the party. In his lessons, he used to wander easily from matters of the German language to topics of history, and from there to current politics, where he would display in passing an impressive amount of insider information. His occasional snide swipes at certain party moguls or attitudes were especially popular, not least because they betrayed an astonishingly accurate knowledge of criticism currently circulating among the people. On that morning we resumed the subject of the Gothic War. For me, the Gothic War had all the elements of a drama. It was full of conflicts of characters and ideas, of love and death, of fortune and of ruin. Altogether, it was a setting that let the contesting figures and concepts appear untainted and flawless in the way the Junge Venier gay want the world to be. It was my Clashmate Krug who dashed forward with the daring thesis that basically the Gothic War was a case of poor leadership, nothing less and nothing more. Krug, a blonde youth with soft features and a rather lavish hairstyle, had a sharp analytical intellect, loved disputes, and was fond of knocking down the positions of others. Combined with this ability was a deep distrust of all convictions, even his own. "I deny that one can call it a tragedy," he declared. "It simply was foolish for the Goths to stay in Italy after Justinianus made it clear he didn't want them in the region. They, a thin stratum of warriors, couldn't hope to conquer the whole world as it was then perceived." "What do you think the Goths' leaders should have done instead?" Hinz asked. "Well, it's hard to say. Perhaps they should have listened to the envoy of their relatives from the north who had urged them to return to where they came from, to Gotland," Krug replied. "I think Krug's view is rather superficial," I began. "The crucial question is what the Gothic kings and their advisers thought they could compromise on and what they thought was inalienable. Obviously, the Goths perceived Italy as their home country, as their Lebensraum, living space, after their ancestors had left Gotland and later had been expelled from the Black Sea. And how can you give up your home? I see. Next he'll say, just like ourselves, fighting for Lebensraum in the east, Krug audibly murmured from the background. Certainly not, I said, looking at him. That wouldn't support my point. The Germans are a nation with a country of their own, after all. I leave the issue of Lebensraum to others to defend. If you want me to name something inalienable in the present, I should say it's the values of European culture that can't be compromised in our fight with Bolshevism. Prudence is irrelevant when it comes to basic convictions. Must I elaborate on that? Certainly you should do so in your essay, though very briefly, Hinz said. Krug resumed his point. You can't deny that the last battle the Goths fought at Vesuvius was a useless sacrifice, a classic example of poor leadership. Did you consider that the alternative would have been slavery, women and children included? Hinz asked. I considered that lives would have been saved, lives that were vital for the survival of the Goths as such. Hasn't the Führer said that the survival of the species is the ultimate goal? Krug sneered. Life is only one of the values I mentioned, I cut in. There are others like freedom, honour and duty. I need not explain that it may be necessary to sacrifice one for the other, do I? And it was for the king to weigh and to decide. That's what he was elected for. He was not free to decide, Krug insisted. He was bound by his loyalty to his people. Teja, the last king, acted disloyally when he sent his men to their deaths. He led his people into ruin. The Goths were physically destroyed. After the Vesuvius battle, the Goths vanished from history. That is the reality we have to acknowledge.